On the face of it, that's a fairly innocuous story, but what it does do is it introduces this concept of a pricing hurdle. It's something which people who are looking for a good price are willing to jump over, but people for whom price is not an issue won't even attempt or just don't care. Hi, I'm Gary, and this is EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. And on the show today, we'll be looking at where the market is in terms of getting cheap public charging. I like to talk about the price of public charging on here because it's an accepted fact that for a potentially quite large number of people in the UK specifically, their financial case for owning an EV is skewed by the fact that they can't charge using a home charger. They are therefore at the mercy of public charge point operators for all their charging. Now, I've done episodes in the past where I've looked at how much it costs to charge on the public network, along with why it's so expensive. And I've also done episodes about ways to reduce your public charging costs. Remember, I've spoken on this show to two drivers who are doing 100% public charging and are still paying less than about 12 pence a mile for this through a combination of destination charging, workplace charging, and overnight charging. And this week, I want to revisit this topic and see whether things have changed since we looked at it last time. At the end of this episode, if you enjoyed it, a like, comment, or a subscribe would be really great. Thank you.
The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence.
First, let's have a quick recap on why prices in the UK are so high and why they aren't quite as high in places like France and Germany. Many people think that the wholesale price of electricity drives the cost of public charging, but in reality, that's just a relatively small percentage of the overall price. What causes pricing for public charging to be expensive is basically two big factors: the cost of installing all these charging hubs and the additional non-supply costs for electricity. We all want nice big charging hubs with canopies, lots of high-powered chargers, grid connections to enable this, facilities, disabled access, canopies, of course we do. But these all cost lots of money. The Instavolt Superhub in Winchester allegedly cost £30 million to build, and that's for solar farm, battery storage, grid connection, 44 ultra-rapid chargers, coffee shop toilets. Someone has to pay for that. And then there's the non-electricity costs related to supplying electricity. We all pay standing charges on our meters, and for a home supply, that's in the region of pennies per day, and mine's around 45 pence a day. For a site such as a hub with a lot of charges, that could be £36,000 a year. Then there's the cost of ensuring that the site gets the full amount of energy it requires. These are called capacity charges, and they all add up, include maintenance, helpline, profit contribution, and suddenly it's an expensive service to provide. Which is why some of the smaller charge point operators that focus primarily on cheaper AC-only installs can provide this at a lower rate. You're not going to want to pay 89 pence a kilowatt hour to plug your car into a charging unit on the side of the street, are you? There is, of course, the VAT aspect, where public charging is subject to a 20% VAT and home charging only 5%. But as I've said on the show before, dropping VAT from 20% down to 5% on a tariff of 89 pence a kilowatt hour is still going to leave you with a tariff of almost 78 pence a kilowatt hour. Better than 89 pence, of course, but still nowhere near as being cost effective as petrol or diesel. That comparison's getting a lot closer given the current Middle East situation. Luckily, things are changing a little. The new Planning and Infrastructure Act 2025 came into force last year, and one thing it did is remove the £500 to £2,000 install costs that CPOs have to pay for a Section 50 license. They're required to get this when a charge point installation requires some digging. It's not a lot, of course, but if you're putting 1,000 chargers into a city and each one requires something like this for a license, that can soon add up. But in Europe, a lot of the costs associated with installing charging hubs are not as onerous as they are in the UK. The grid doesn't demand thousands of pounds per year per unit now just to pay for the cost of upgrading the grid so that a charge point operator can add an additional 10 units in 10 years' time. Nor do they charge huge capacity charges to ensure that if a CPO has 10 500 kilowatt units at a site, they all receive the maximum power if they're all plugged in at the same time. Which does make me wonder about those sites that have lots of chargers installed but not enough power to allow them all to run at maximum capacity at the same time. Are they also paying capacity fees for those sites? Hashtag if you know, you know. There are still people who'll tell you that charging costs around 90 pence a kilowatt hour. And that's right for some of the top charge point operators. But there are also people who've been on the podcast who charge their cars 100% in public for 10 or 12 pence a mile, which is less than diesel. Much less nowadays, of course. So let's look at this from 2 points of view. What are the costs of doing a long-distance journey in the UK, paying full price? And how does that differ if you start to look at various cheaper charge point operators that are available? Now, if you can charge at home, a long-distance journey is still going to work out cheaper than using petrol or diesel, especially if you're going abroad where the price of public charging is less onerous. If we assume you can fill your car up overnight with cheap off-peak electricity at 7 pence a kilowatt hour, that brings your price down to around 2 pence a mile. Even if you use your peak rate electricity to charge up, that's around 30 pence a kilowatt hour, and it makes your average around 7.5 pence a mile. For price parity, we need to beat 15 pence a mile for diesel, 16 pence for petrol as per ZapMap. A normal driver doing the majority of their driving from home and filling overnight is paying between 2 and 7.5 pence a mile on home charging, and that's at least half the cost of wet fuel. So if you take the occasional longer journey where they need to pay higher public charging costs of 65, 75, 85 pence a kilowatt hour, they're still better off than if they're buying petrol or diesel 100% of the time. But what about those that can't charge at home? Or those that have home charging but also cover a large number of miles per year on the public network? The math shown above starts to break down fairly quickly, which is where the cheaper charging options come into play. Now, these fall into two main areas: CPOs that charge less per kilowatt hour as a baseline, and offerings that reduce the price per kilowatt hour. Now, in the first group, we have off-peak rates such as those offered by companies like InstaVolt and BEV overnight, or late evening and early morning. And this means you can get a good charge for a lot less than if you plug in during the day. Then there's companies that run overnight charging on AC. If you're parked overnight somewhere that has an AC charger on the pavement, you can use rates such as Charge's 39 pence a kilowatt hour overnight offering, and that equates to around 9.5 pence a mile. There are even places such as the local Pod, formerly Pod Point charger, at a nearby Aldi that can drop to around 25 pence a kilowatt hour, about the same or even cheaper than home charging. Now, if you don't want to head out and charge overnight, you can take advantage of subscription services to dramatically drop your charging costs. Ionity have a Power Plus subscription, which for $10.99 a month drops their tariff from 74 pence a kilowatt hour to 43 pence a kilowatt hour, and that's around 11 pence a mile. BEV have a similar subscription offering that drops their price down to 39 pence a kilowatt hour during the day, 9.5 pence a mile. Even Tesla, the granddaddy of cheap charging, have a subscription offering which can drop their tariffs down to as little as 23 pence a kilowatt hour. Even their peak rate drops to 41 pence a kilowatt hour, or 10 pence a mile. But these aren't the only ways you can get cheaper charging. But unfortunately, all ways involve a little friction. Now, I'm studying a couple of economics principles at the moment, and one book I'm reading gave the following example about a concept known as the pricing hurdle. The author had booked a hotel room at £100 per night, and when he checked in, he saw a sign behind the receptionist saying, "Ask about our special rates." So he asked, and she gave him a 25% discount. On the face of it, that's a fairly innocuous story, but what it does do is it introduces this concept of a pricing hurdle. It's something which people who are looking for a good price are willing to jump over, but people for whom price is not an issue won't even attempt or just don't care. Now, the hotel example is a little trite and simple. Ask and you shall receive. But here's an example that's a little closer to what a lot of us understand. Back in 2007, the price of a single journey on the London Underground was £4. But if you paid with an Oyster card, which had recently been introduced, the same journey would cost you £1.50. But in order to do that, you needed to jump the pricing hurdle. In this case, that hurdle involved filling in a form and applying for a card in advance. Those people who are price sensitive will jump that hurdle in order to save £2.50 per journey. Others that are not sensitive won't jump that hurdle and will pay the full price. In the charging world, the hurdle that many people have to jump comes in various forms. Hunting for a charge point operator in a unit that offers cheaper charging rather than using the closest one, downloading and setting up an app and an associated account with all the profile and password creation that entails, setting up and paying for a subscription, applying for an RFID card, waiting for it to arrive and authorizing it on a web page or app. Now, if you are price sensitive, that's something you'll do. For a lot of people, though, price is not a driver. Patrick Dunn from SmartCharge told us on this very show that when they surveyed their users, price was not the top driver when it came to charging. It was either second or third. Without hunting back through the episode, I'm not sure which one it was. Feel free to check. For a lot of business users who are expensing their charging back to their company, the price is often not an issue, although it might be to the accountants running that company. For some people with limited time, the need to faff around and set up apps and accounts and subscriptions is too much of a hurdle, and they'll settle for paying whatever the ad hoc charging price is, providing they can just wave their contactless payment card and go. For some people on a specific timetable, charging now at a higher tariff is preferable to charging in 2 hours' time when the tariff has dropped to a lower off-peak time of day tariff. That's the hurdle they refuse to jump. So let's look at what's out there and bear in mind the pricing hurdle concept as we discuss them. Now, I've mentioned Lecky.net before on this show. Now, alongside ChargeNet.co.uk, it's one of the top online sources of pricing for all charge point operators in the UK. With Lecky.net, you can look at all prices and sort them by price per mile equivalent, assuming an EV with an efficiency of 3.5 miles a kilowatt hour, or display and sort them by pence per kilowatt hour. And what this does allow is it allows you to identify those cheap CPOs that can offer cheaper charging and under what conditions. So let's take a look at some of the pricing offers. We'll start with some slow AC charging. Select the filter, price per kilowatt hour, and we can see that the cheapest shown is Chargy with their pay-as-you-go basic day tariff of 39 pence a kilowatt hour. There's no hurdle there. If you're at a Chargy unit, that's what you pay. Pod, formerly PodPoint, also offers 7 kilowatt charging at a Tesco for 44 pence a kilowatt hour. The hurdle here is that you have to be at a Tesco site. Total Energies, formerly Source London, also offer a 22 kilowatt resident rate of 49 pence a kilowatt hour, although this is a calculated rate as the actual tariff consists of various prices that apply. So see the Total Energy website for more details. Now, the hurdle here is that you need to be in London and have been set up as a resident on their system to receive that rate. Now, if we swap over to the fast charging tab, we can see charging prices for quote-unquote fast charging. Top of the page with the lowest rate is BEV, and their phenomenal 39 pence a kilowatt hour subscription, $9.99 a month, 24/7 charging, 39 pence a kilowatt hour. The hurdle here is the subscription aspect. Chargy, again, rank really highly on this page with their 39 pence a kilowatt hour rate. Lidl come next with their 40 pence fast AC with Lidl Plus offering. This involves downloading an app, creating an account, getting a 15 pence a kilowatt hour discount on their standard AC charging rate. Let's go up another level to rapid charging. And this is where we start to get serious charging at unserious pricing. Top of the table with the bottom of the table pricing is Tesla for members or owners. If you own a Tesla, you can get off-peak charging at all the Tesla sites around the country for a price that ranges from around 22 pence a kilowatt hour to 27 pence a kilowatt hour. Each site has a slightly different pricing structure, so you'll need to check your in-car display about what the price is going to be. If you don't own a Tesla and you have to turn up without a subscription, the price will rise to between about 30 pence and 38 pence a kilowatt hour if you charge off-peak. Tesla's off-peak times vary by site, but you're usually looking at around 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., but some sites are midnight to 9 a.m. If you turn up at peak times, i.e. during the day, you can now be paying up to 63 pence a kilowatt hour for Tesla charging. Gone are the days of Tesla is half the price of other CPOs. Now, the hurdle for these low prices as a non-Tesla driver is the need to set up a subscription and access the system via an app. Next on our list of cheap providers is Ionity with their Passport Power subscription. We mentioned it earlier, $10.99 a month. You get a discount from 81 pence a kilowatt hour down to 42 pence a kilowatt hour. Now, I'm not going to go through every different offer and combination, but I do want to say something about the general trend that I think I'm seeing. With a number of charge point operators, and I include Instavolt, BEV, Raw Charging, and Tesla in this list, they've gone for a pricing model that allows for tiered pricing depending on the time of day. If you're willing to wait for an off-peak time, you can get a discount on charging. This is the pricing hurdle we talked about earlier. Are you willing to wait up until a set time, drive out to a charger and sit there for 30 minutes, 45 minutes or an hour in order to get cheap charging? It wasn't more than a few years back when this wasn't even a consideration. For the most part, the price was the price regardless of when you plugged in. Even with known off-peak electricity rates being provided to domestic customers, these were not available to businesses, so they had no opportunity to reduce their prices. But last year, Instavolt at their Winchester Super Hub decided that they would take the advantage of the solar power and battery storage on site to offer a reduced off-peak rate of, if I remember correctly, about 50 pence a kilowatt hour. I'm sure somebody will correct me with that if I'm wrong. Since then, as listed above, a couple of others have jumped on that bandwagon. It makes sense, really, because a charge point operator is looking to increase utilization. If they can increase utilization at a time of low current utilization, they'll do that in order to reduce their unit cost per overhead. And by that, I mean that regardless of whether they sell 1 kilowatt hour of energy or 1 terawatt hour of energy, they still have fixed costs for wages, buildings, and help desk to cover. The larger the number of kilowatt hours dispensed, the smaller the contribution of each kilowatt hour towards that overhead. If it means they could do that without materially impacting their peak times, it made sense to do that. Although I'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of the meetings where pricing and tariffs like this were discussed. On our recent conversation with Neil Broadband from Raw Charging, I asked him if anyone had looked at reducing pricing to increase utilization rather than using increased utilization to reduce pricing. And he told me...
No, it makes sense. I wouldn't say that specific conversations happened partly because it's almost there are multiple conversations in one go in many ways, but I think it comes back to that certainty. So, yeah, arguably there is a leap of faith around price being the ultimate deciding factor. So, again, going back to our destination heritage within our mindset and within our kind of thinking process, we if you go to Blue Water Shopping Centre, we always use that as the best example. You aren't necessarily being driven by price because it is a premium retail location. So perhaps your decision as to whether you do or don't charge there would be based on how close the charging is to the shop that you want to go to, or how fast is the charging relative to the time that you're going to spend there. So we do take a case by case or archetype by archetype approach to our pricing across our network. So there are the more community local charging solutions. They are more driven perhaps by price, whereas in some locations, drivers are much more about the experience.
So perhaps someone might have that conversation. Perhaps that's what BEV have done. They're currently blazing a trail when it comes to cheap charging with their subscription offering, giving you 24/7 charging at 39 pence a kilowatt hour, or their off-peak tariff, giving you the same 39 pence a kilowatt hour between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. I will also remind you that podcast sponsor ZapMap has recently updated their app to show prices on the little map pins so you can see at a glance what the price is at a given charger. A couple of caveats to note for that. If there are cheap AC and expensive DC at a single site, the app will display the cheap AC price on the pin. If the CPO isn't sharing their price with ZapMap, it won't show. I'm looking at UBP Pulse. And if you're trying to access it via CarPlay, that interface won't allow price display at the moment. So let's summarize what we've learned today. Primarily, the headline of public charging is expensive is both accurate and misleading. It's a little like saying buying groceries is expensive. Now, it can be if you buy at Harrods, Fortnum & Mason or Waitrose. If you're buying at Aldi, Lidl and Tesco, probably going to be cheaper. But there's also the pricing hurdle to get over, which is that if you want to take advantage of some cheap offerings, there's a little bit of friction you might have to go through. This could be locating specific CPOs or needing to use an app or setting up a subscription account beforehand. The question you need to ask yourself is whether this hurdle is one you're willing to leap for a charging discount.
The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers in the UK, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence wherever you go. Download ZapMap and you'll get the UK's most comprehensive charging map in your pocket, with a range of filters so you can personalise the map to suit your specific EV model. So it's easy to find the best charge for you, whether you're charging on street, en route, or at your destination. You can even see live charger availability and price information in the app, helping you choose your charger at a glance and turn up with total confidence that it will work, it will be available, and it'll be in your budget. Plus, you can pay through the app or with a tap of the ZapMap charging card at thousands of charge points nationwide. No need to download a different app for each charging network. You can download ZapMap for free or check out ZapMap Premium for charging discounts, in-car compatibility, and additional filters.
I hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. If you've got any comments, please let me know, either in the comments section below, if you're on YouTube, or by emailing me at info@evmusings.com. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general messages to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. And on the socials, I'm on Blue Sky at evmusings.bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at evmusings, where I post short videos and podcast extracts regularly. So why not follow me there? Thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on the monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc one. If you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/evmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/evmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. Now, regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks. So you've gone electric, and so you've gone renewable. First one of those has had a recent update. You'll see it with a bright red image on the front, just like I'm showing on the screen here. Both of those are 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on the Amazon Kindle store. Check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, I know you're probably driving or walking or jogging or in the shower or washing the car, but if you can remember and you enjoyed this episode, drop a review in iTunes, please. Really helps me out. I did go in and have a look recently at some of the most recent reviews. Thank you very much for those who took time to do that for me. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by messaging me at musingtv.bsky.social with the words cheaper than the headline says. Hashtag if you know, nothing else. Thanks, as always, to my co-founder, Simon. Another quiet week from him. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye now.